That's the most ridiculous lie I've ever heard in 20 years of teaching. Mrs. Patricia Whitmore's voice echoed like a thunderclap across the room, piercing the quiet morning air of Jefferson Elementary. Her eyes blazed with disbelief as she held up Lucas Hughes's carefully written note. "Your mother, a four-star general? Don't make me laugh." Then, in front of every single fourth grader, she tore his paper to shreds. Each rip sounded like a verdict, sharp and final. The scraps fluttered to the floor like snow landing on Lucas's worn sneakers. 10-year-old Lucas froze, his chest tightening as though the teacher's words had physically pushed the air from his lungs. Every eye in the room was on him, wide and unblinking, while the paper fragments drifted helplessly around his feet. He could feel the stares burning into him, their weight heavier than any backpack he had ever carried. 2 hours earlier, Lucas had woken up to the familiar, calm voice of his mother calling from downstairs. "Breakfast in 5, soldier," she said. The Hughes family lived in a modest 3-bedroom apartment in Arlington, Virginia. From their living room window, you could just catch the bugle signaling the morning at Fort Myer, a faint reminder of the military world his mother commanded. The apartment was neat, but lived in. Family photos lined the walls, small awards and letters peeked from shelves, but there was nothing ostentatious about it. No uniforms on display, no medals in frames, no flags, no plaques. General Margaret Hughes didn't advertise what she did. Excellence for her was quiet, precise, and often invisible. Lucas had dressed quickly, hoping to get to school before any teasing could start. He knew some kids would make fun if they realized his mother was more than just a regular mom. They didn't understand the discipline, the long nights, or the missions she had led. He tucked his note into his backpack, a carefully written explanation about his mom's achievements, proof that he wasn't making anything up. Now standing in the classroom, he wished he had never brought it. Mrs. Whitmore's glare was merciless. "You don't get to make up fairy tales about being special, Lucas. Generals live in big houses. Their children go to private schools. They drive expensive cars. They certainly don't show up looking like, well, like you." Her voice dropped to an icy whisper as she emphasized the last words. Lucas's hands trembled, and he could feel the sting of embarrassment crawling up his neck. He wanted to speak, to explain, but the words caught in his throat. The classroom felt impossibly small, like a cage, each desk a barrier, every student a silent judge. From the back of the room, a few classmates whispered, their voices barely audible over the teacher's tirade. "Did you see that? He's lying again. This is so embarrassing." Lucas's stomach churned. The boy who had once proudly told stories about his mother now wanted to vanish into the floor. Mrs. Whitmore crumpled the torn pieces of Lucas's note into a ball and dropped them into the trash with a deliberate flourish. "Pathetic," she spat, taking a small step closer, her heels clicking sharply against the classroom floor. "Have you ever watched a teacher destroy a child for being black and telling the truth? Well, now you have." Her words dripped with cruelty Lucas couldn't comprehend at his age. The humiliation wasn't just in her words, it was in her certainty, her authority. It was in the way she made him feel invisible, wrong, and somehow unworthy of belief. He could hear the shuffling of chairs, the coughs of students pretending not to watch, and the muffled giggles of those who didn't understand. Lucas clenched his fists at his sides. He thought of his mother, a 4-star general who commanded armies and respect across continents, a woman whose very presence demanded attention and discipline. But she had taught him that courage wasn't about shouting or proving everyone wrong. Courage was knowing the truth in your heart and holding on to it, even when the world mocked you. A sudden knock at the door startled everyone. Heads turned instinctively, curiosity snapping through the tension in the room. Lucas's heart jumped. Who could it be? He dare not hope. It could just be another interruption, another distraction. but something deep inside whispered that change was coming. Mrs. Whitmore's glare was merciless. "You don't get to make up fairy tales about being special, Lucas. Generals live in big houses. Their children go to private schools. They drive expensive cars. They certainly don't show up looking like you." Her voice dropped to an icy whisper as she emphasized the last words. Everyone was watching Lucas, ears pricked. The teacher continued her tirade, pinning him to the spot. Lucas withdrew into himself, hands shaking, a school day blaring into his mind, and no one by his side. He felt the weight of the world's cruelty on his shoulders. He remembered his mother's calm voice and broke into tears as though a perfect Christmas morning had been snatched from his grasp. A sudden knock at the door startled everyone. Heads turned instinctively, curiosity snapping through the tension in the room. Lucas's heart jumped. Who could it be? He dare not hope. It could just be another interruption, another distraction, but something deep inside whispered that change was coming. Mrs. Whitmore's glare narrowed at the sound. "I don't know who that is," she said, her voice tight, defensive. "This is my classroom, my rules. No one interrupts me." The knocking came again, firmer this time, deliberate, commanding attention. The room fell silent. Even the whispers ceased. All that remained was the sound of Lucas's shallow breaths and the teacher's irritated huff. Lucas's classmates exchanged glances, confusion and fear in their eyes. Something was different this time. The air itself seemed to shift, a subtle current of authority slicing through the tension like a knife. Lucas felt a surge of hope, a spark of courage he hadn't known he possessed. He straightened his back, wiped his sweaty palms on his pants, and looked toward the door. For the first time that morning, he dared to imagine that maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't be alone in defending the truth.
2 minutes passed in tense silence after the knock, each second stretching longer than the last. Lucas's small chest rose and fell as he tried to steady his racing heart. The classroom, once filled with the muffled whispers of fourth graders, now felt like a stage set for something extraordinary. Every pair of eyes, students and teacher alike, was fixed on the doorway, waiting, uncertain, expectant. Meanwhile, miles away from the chaos of the school, General Margaret Hughes had just finished a briefing at Fort Myer. Lucas's mother was no stranger to authority or the weight of expectation. She was a 4-star general, one of the youngest ever to reach her rank, and her reputation was legendary. But Margaret Hughes carried her accomplishments quietly. She wasn't one to flaunt medals, ribbons, or accolades. Her leadership was precise, disciplined, and invisible unless you were directly affected by it. This was one of the reasons Lucas had never feared his mother's influence in daily life. He'd grown up seeing her as both protector and teacher, not as an untouchable figure of awe. At home, she was just mom, patient, guiding, strict, but loving. She cooked, helped with homework, and made sure Lucas understood the importance of integrity and courage. She had drilled him with one simple lesson since he could walk. The truth is your shield. Never let anyone take it from you, even if the world laughs at it. Yet here she was, miles from her home in Arlington, standing just outside a door that her son had feared would break him. The receptionist at the school had called her, her voice tight with urgency. "General Hughes, there's an incident with your son. You should come immediately." Margaret had felt a chill run down her spine. She had known the moment her son entered that school, he might face challenges, but never had she imagined this level of public humiliation. She had seen teachers scold children, but never destroy their dignity in front of their peers. She adjusted her blazer,
glanced down at Lucas's picture on her phone, and set off toward Jefferson Elementary, every step a measured decision to assert calm and control. Back in the classroom, Mrs. Whitmore's voice finally cut through the growing tension. "I don't have time for nonsense. Your mother," she began, but the door opened before she could finish. The room went dead silent. Heads turned, jaws dropped. The figure in the doorway was tall, upright, exuding authority in a way that was impossible to ignore. Margaret Hughes didn't need to raise her voice. Her presence alone demanded attention. Her uniform, impeccable and adorned with subtle indicators of her rank, was a quiet statement of the authority she carried. But even without it, the aura she emitted was unmistakable: command, confidence, and justice. Lucas felt a surge of relief and awe. His mother's eyes, sharp yet soft, met his, and for the first time that morning he felt seen, truly seen. His classmates shifted nervously in their seats. Some whispered, others gawked openly. Mrs. Whitmore stiffened, her confidence faltering under the weight of someone who did not need to argue to be believed. Margaret's gaze swept across the room, taking in the chaos, the ripped paper, the trembling boy, the disbelieving faces of the students. She didn't need to speak immediately. Her presence was an invisible gavel striking down injustice. Then she walked in, each step deliberate, measured, echoing softly against the linoleum floor. "Is this the behavior we are displaying to our children today?" she asked, her voice calm but laced with authority. Every word carried a weight that made Mrs. Whitmore flinch. Lucas could hardly breathe. His heart felt like it might burst, but in the same moment, he felt courage filling him. He remembered every lesson his mother had taught him, every word about integrity, about standing firm. "Mom," he whispered, almost disbelievingly. Margaret knelt down to meet his eyes. "Lucas," she said softly, "are you all right?" "Yes," he murmured, though his voice shook. She nodded once, then rose. Her eyes locked with Mrs. Whitmore's. "I've heard everything," Margaret said evenly. "I came as soon as I could, but let me be clear. My son speaks the truth, and it will always be treated with respect in this classroom." Mrs. Whitmore's mouth opened, then closed. She had no words. The certainty in Margaret Hughes's voice, the calm yet undeniable authority she carried, was suffocating in its power. The students watched in stunned silence, realizing that the balance of power in the room had shifted completely. Lucas's mother looked around at the room, her presence filling every corner. "Every child deserves dignity," she continued, her voice firm but not unkind. "And every teacher should remember why they chose this profession, to guide, not to belittle." The message was clear. The teacher's arrogance, her prejudice, and her disbelief had no place here, not today, not ever. And though Lucas still trembled slightly from the humiliation he had endured, he knew something had changed. Someone with true authority was on his side, and justice, quiet, precise, inevitable, was about to unfold. Outside the classroom, the world continued in its ordinary way, but inside, a quiet storm had begun. The fourth graders, who had moments ago been whispering and staring, now sat silently, absorbing the gravity of what was happening. Lucas felt a strange mixture of fear and relief. Fear because confrontation with authority, even in favor of truth, was never easy. Relief because at last long the truth would have its champion. And the champion had arrived.
The classroom fell into a stunned silence as General Margaret Hughes stepped fully into the room. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice. Every inch of her presence radiated control, discipline,
and unwavering confidence. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to dim in the weight of her aura. Mrs. Whitmore, once so commanding, suddenly looked small, her arrogance replaced by unease. Her eyes darted nervously, her lips pressed into a thin line. For the first time that morning, she was no longer the person in charge. The scales had tipped. Margaret's gaze swept over the students first. "Sit up straight," she said softly, almost more like a reminder than a command. The children obeyed instantly, their whispers vanishing as if swept away by an invisible hand. Then her eyes landed on Lucas, and she softened. A small nod, barely perceptible, reassured him that he was no longer alone. Finally, she turned her attention to the teacher. "Mrs. Whitmore," Margaret began, her voice calm yet firm, every word measured and precise. "I understand there has been a misunderstanding here. I am General Margaret Hughes, Lucas's mother, and I have been informed about the incident." The words hit Mrs. Whitmore like a thunderclap. Her eyes widened in disbelief, her posture stiffening defensively. "General Hughes, she stammered, clearly grasping for authority that had evaporated the moment Margaret walked in. "I've heard everything," Margaret continued, cutting through her attempts at justification. "From what I understand, my son presented an assignment about his mother's career, and instead of supporting him, you chose to humiliate him in front of the entire class." The teacher opened her mouth, then closed it. Words failed her. Margaret didn't need them. Her presence alone carried authority. Every student in the room felt it. Even the whispered comments from moments ago had disappeared. Lucas felt a rush of relief mixed with awe. He had endured ridicule and disbelief, but now someone with true power and respect was standing beside him. Someone who would not allow lies, bias, or prejudice to overshadow the truth. Margaret stepped closer, her gaze steady and unwavering. Lucas's words were truthful. He did not make up stories about me or my work. "You," she said, her eyes meeting Mrs. Whitmore's directly, "have no right to question the integrity of my child, especially in such a cruel, public manner." The teacher swallowed hard, her face pale. She tried to defend herself. I didn't mean to." Margaret raised her hand slightly, not in anger but in quiet command. "You need to understand the weight of your actions. Public humiliation is not education. Demeaning a child for telling the truth is unacceptable and it will not be tolerated." The room was still. Every student was watching, wide-eyed. Some gasped softly, others simply stared in awe. The power shift was absolute, undeniable. Margaret Hughes didn't yell, didn't demand apologies immediately. She simply stood firm, and that was enough. Then, with calm authority, she looked back at Lucas. "I know it's difficult to stand up when people doubt you," she said gently. "But today you did exactly what you needed to do. Tell the truth. Never forget that your voice matters, no matter how small you feel." Lucas felt tears prick his eyes. Relief, pride, and validation flooded him at once. For the first time that morning, he stood tall. He was no longer the trembling boy crushed by humiliation. He was Lucas Hughes, son of a general, a boy whose truth could not be denied. Finally, Margaret turned to the classroom. "And let this be a lesson to everyone here. Every child deserves respect, and every teacher is entrusted with a sacred responsibility to guide, to nurture, and to protect, not to belittle or destroy." The statement hung in the air like a weighty truth. Mrs. Whitmore's shoulders slumped, and she could no longer meet the general's eyes. The students shifted uneasily, sensing the finality of the moment. Justice had quietly, but unmistakably, arrived. Lucas glanced at his mother and whispered a soft, grateful, "Thank you." She smiled briefly, a small nod of reassurance, and the classroom atmosphere shifted entirely. Fear and humiliation had been replaced with awe, respect, and the undeniable realization that the truth had finally been honored. Outside, the morning sun continued to shine, oblivious to the small revolution of dignity and authority that had unfolded within the walls of Jefferson Elementary. But inside, a lesson had been learned, one that none of the students would ever forget.
Mrs. Whitmore stood frozen, her usual confidence shattered by the calm authority of General Margaret Hughes. For the first time in her 23-year career, she faced someone whose presence alone could silence the room, and she knew it. No amount of yelling, no sharp tone, no authority she once wielded could compete with the quiet command of a 4-star general. The students, who had been shifting nervously in their seats just moments ago, now stared in wide-eyed awe. Whispers had vanished entirely. Even the smallest cough seemed sacrilegious in the weight of the moment. Every child could sense the reversal of power. This was no ordinary teacher-student confrontation. This was justice, personified. Lucas, still trembling slightly, felt his chest loosen. The fear that had gripped him since Mrs. Whitmore tore his assignment to shreds was melting, replaced with a sense of pride and validation he had never known. He straightened his back, lifted his chin, and met his mother's calm gaze. In that look, he found encouragement, and the silent reminder that truth had allies, even in the darkest moments. Mrs. Whitmore's lips moved, forming words that never seemed to leave her mouth. She opened them again, trying to speak, but Margaret's eyes held her in place. Every student in the room watched, seeing the once intimidating teacher reduced to silence. It was a quiet, complete humiliation, far more powerful than any shouting or punishment could have achieved. "You may think your actions were discipline," Margaret said softly, her tone precise, "but they were cruelty disguised as authority. Tearing a child's work, mocking their family, belittling their honesty, these are not lessons. They are failures, and today they are visible for all to see." Mrs. Whitmore swallowed hard, the color draining from her face. She shifted her weight uneasily, realizing that the very students she had tried to dominate were witnessing her fall from power. Each child understood the truth now. The boy had done nothing wrong, and the adult in charge had overstepped every boundary of respect. Lucas felt a rush of vindication. For years he had navigated a world that often doubted him because of the color of his skin. Today, that doubt was shattered. His mother's presence, her unwavering defense of his truth, transformed his humiliation into empowerment. The boy who had once felt invisible now stood illuminated, seen for exactly who he was: brave, honest, and resilient. Margaret's gaze softened as she looked at Lucas again. "Remember this, Lucas. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear silence the truth. Today you have done exactly that." The teacher's shoulders slumped further, her arrogance replaced with a heavy awareness of her mistakes. The students, inspired and awed, began to murmur quietly among themselves. Respect had shifted entirely, from fear of the teacher to admiration for the boy and his mother. Lucas felt a surge of confidence, a quiet pride blooming in his chest. He had survived the moment that could have broken him, and more importantly, he had been defended with the authority and integrity of someone who truly mattered. The lesson was clear. No matter how impossible it may seem, truth and courage always find their allies. Mrs. Whitmore finally lowered her gaze, the unspoken acknowledgement of defeat heavy in the room. And though she had once held power, today it belonged entirely to Lucas, the boy who told the truth and the mother who walked in to ensure it was respected.
The classroom was silent, but it was no longer tense. The air, once thick with fear and humiliation, now carried a sense of awe and respect. Lucas Hughes sat up straighter, feeling a weight lift from his small shoulders. The boy who had entered that morning trembling with anxiety and shame was no longer the same child. Today, he had experienced something far greater than anyone in the room could have imagined: justice, courage, and validation. Mrs. Whitmore remained at the front of the class, her face pale and rigid.
For 23 years, she had believed herself to be untouchable, a figure of authority whose word was law. But she had misjudged Lucas, and she had misjudged the power of truth when it was backed by integrity and courage. Today, she had learned a lesson she would never forget. True authority is not about intimidation or fear. It is about fairness, respect, and understanding. Lucas's classmates looked at him differently now. The whispers of doubt and ridicule had been replaced with quiet admiration. Some stole glances at him, smiling subtly as though acknowledging the strength it took to endure what he had just faced. Others simply sat in stunned silence, absorbing the gravity of what they had witnessed. For them, the lesson was clear. Appearances can be deceiving, and courage often comes from the most unexpected places. Margaret Hughes knelt beside Lucas once more, her presence gentle yet firm. "You did exactly the right thing, Lucas," she said softly. "Never let anyone make you feel less than who you are. Courage and truth are your strongest allies. They always have been, and they always will be." Lucas nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He had learned more than just vindication today. He had learned the power of truth, the importance of standing tall even when the world seems against you, and the extraordinary strength that comes from having someone who believes in you unconditionally. As the students slowly returned to their lessons, the lesson of the morning lingered like a quiet echo. It was a story they would carry with them for years, the day a boy was humiliated and almost broken, only to be defended by the one person who could ensure the truth prevailed. And as for Lucas, he knew that the world outside the classroom would continue to challenge him, but today had given him something far more valuable than a piece of paper. He had been seen, heard, and believed. To everyone watching this story unfold, remember, courage isn't measured by the absence of fear, but the strength to speak the truth when it matters most. If this story inspired you, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a moment of unbelievable, real-life stories that remind us all of hope, justice, and bravery. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? We'd love to hear from you and share more stories that touch the heart and ignite courage in every corner of the world. The sun shone brightly outside Jefferson Elementary, but inside, a small boy had discovered something far brighter: the unwavering power of truth, the protective shield of those who believe in him, and the knowledge that even the harshest injustice could be overturned when courage and integrity lead the way.